Hello, everybody. This is Andy Bennett. On the interpretive staff of the CSS News Civil War Interpretive Center in Kinston, North Carolina. The topic I'm going to be talking about today is the cultural influences on cuisine and how the Civil War shaped what we eat. First, we need to kind of define cultural influences on cuisine. The cuisine, no matter where you're from, no matter what country, a cuisine is affected by what you can grow in your region, um, the cooking traditions and habits of the people who live there, um, and that can be influenced by religious practices of how they cook or what they eat and what they don't eat. So there's how your culture, your religion, your taboos, your beliefs, and then what you can grow, physically on your land is going to affect what you eat, your cuisine. That's how your culture and environment affect what you eat. And so each individual culture that came to America or part of the American cuisine is going to affect what we eat back then and now. So we're going to go through and talk about some of those different cultures before the American Civil War, and then we'll get into how the war itself shaped how those blended together. Okay, let's go. We're going to start off right at the very beginning in colonial times. We're going to we're going to break this into the Northeast, and we're going to talk about the southeastern part of the United States where the first colonies were. First, the native peoples, the Indians of North America, those cultures and how they lived vary greatly. We have different cultures, different focuses. We have some cultures that are more hunter gatherers. We have some that are more farm related. Some are more hunting and fishing related cultures. They speak different languages. They dress different. They have different religious beliefs, depending on where they're at. There's at least hundreds of Native American cultures up and down the eastern seaboard. We're here in Kinston is in eastern North Carolina, so I'm going to talk a little bit about North Carolina. We had tribes along the coast that primarily harvested shellfish and fish from the sounds and rivers. And as you come inland into the river system, you got hunter gatherers and farmers. And you get into central North Carolina, you have very large mound building cultures that they're primarily farmers. And as you go into western North Carolina, you have large dominant tribes, predominantly the Cherokee. So in this landscape, you have those native peoples and how they cook. They don't have access to metal pots and pans, so they're primarily going to grill meat on a wood grill. They do have clay pots that eventually they're able to waterproof, so they're going to boil a lot of items. So they're mainly like cooking, barbecuing meat and boiling vegetables. Um, into those traditions, the settlers that settled in North Carolina are English settlers from all over England. You have English and Scottish border Scots that settle in eastern North Carolina. Some Swiss settle in the town of New Bern area. We have Highland Scots that settle along the Cape River Valley into Fayetteville, North Carolina, into the coast. We have German settlers that settle into the Piedmont area of North Carolina, and a mix of Germans and Scots and English that settle into western North Carolina. So you've got all these English culture, English and German and Scottish and Swiss cultures. They have their own culinary traditions and likes and dislikes and things they cook are thrown into the Native American habits that are here. And then we have the enslaved people that come from all over Africa, Africa all on the western coast, and those are different traditions, different religious beliefs, and different access to different items they were used to have access to cook with. A lot of the fruits and vegetables and And legumes we're used to eating today are from Central and South America and North America. So they had been coming over to the New World for hundreds of years before anyone settled here in North Carolina, Virginia. So some of those native plants were taken to Europe and Africa and used there, so they knew about them when they come. They brought them back with them in sometimes different forms, and the enslaved people were familiar with all kinds of native vegetables and plants they brought kind of back with them that they favored, and some native from Africa. So you have the enslaved population, the European population, and native population that affect the cuisine. Some of the things here in North Carolina that we have that are still popular today, that are kind of have a direct connection to this blending of cultures, is we have something called Brunswick stew, which is it's a tomato-based stew with corn and beans and chicken and stuff in it, and it has a direct connection to the fish stews that the native peoples along the different rivers cooked. And we still, a lot of communities along some of our rivers still do a fish stew that's very similar, but those two stews. The whole concept of whole hog barbecue in Eastern North Carolina, where we roast a whole pig over a fire, slow roast it and eat that, and that's what we call barbecues, pork barbecue. That is influenced from the Native Americans cooking fish. It comes from the native peoples of the Caribbean. Some of these ideas are brought here by early English settlers and early pirates to coastal North Carolina. Cornbread, corn's from come from North America, so that's a connection to Native Americans here in the Southeast. Let's talk about a little about the Northeast. The Northeast, same way. No matter whether you're in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Maine, we've got different Native American tribes with different beliefs, different things that they're going to be able to grow in the climate of the Northeast and what they're used to eating. And then you have settlers there in the Northeast. You have the English settlers, you have Scottish settlers, you have the Dutch, you have Scandinavian settlers, early Scandinavian settlers to there that people forget about in colonial times. Those mixes with the Native Americans, those European cultures. And then they do have enslaved people in the Northeast. It affects their food culture a little less than it does in the Southeast. They mainly get a good influence of enslaved people's culture from some of the spices and people from the Caribbean, kind of mix of Native American and Africans and Caribbean. That influence comes to the Northeast. So you have those colonial blends, and then you have trade. Trade adds the spices that change our culinary experience. Most of those spices come from the Spice Islands from India, newest modern day Indonesia, Southeast Asia. They come through trade. And of course, you have a large harbor. You're going to have more and more spices influx into your harbor, and that's going to affect your cooking, obviously. So you've got trade, what you naturally grow in your area, the cultural and religious habits those people are going to blend into what makes your cooking. So we have those colonists, colonial America. As we move west after the American Revolution, we're running into new Native American cultures that we've never run into before. We're running into cultures that are heavily influenced as we go into Florida. Into the Louisiana Purchase, we're running into people who have a strong Spanish influence and Portuguese influence on their culture, and in different new Native American cultures, we're starting to run into cultures in the Mississippi Valley that have more close ties to Mesoamerica from Mexico, the Aztecs and the Mayans. So they have different, ingredients they use, and then of course during the U.S.-Mexican War, U.S. soldiers are going to go to Mexico, and they're going to bring back all kinds of chili peppers. The taste buds of America change from the classic colonial spices that we think about: cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice. Those are going to change. In the 1840s, after U.S.-Mexican War, we get a taste for hot and spicy stuff. So we have more cayenne pepper seeds are brought back. We're starting growing those in America, both in the North and in the South. And as we move western expansion, going out there, as the lands open up, we're getting a new influx of the immigrants we have. Before it was mainly English and Scottish and a little bit of Germans. Now in the 1840s, we have the Irish potato famine, so we have a big influx of Irish immigrants that are coming mainly to the ports in the Northeast, but also in the Southeast. We're going to have another influx of German immigrants during this time period. Because in the 1840s to 1850s, there are wars across Europe that we don't think about, between the different German principalities and wars into what are more Eastern Europe. So we're having Germans come over. We're having a lot of Irish. We're having other immigrants from Eastern Europe, and coming into the time period of the American Civil War, we have immigrants from Southeastern Europe coming because of wars there. The wars of Italian unification are bringing in immigrants. So you have these pockets of culture in the Midwest, around the Great Lakes, in Minnesota, Wisconsin, some of these new frontiers that we have a lot of immigrants form communities. So you have distinctive Irish communities, distinctive German communities, distinctive Polish communities, distinctive Scandinavian communities. And these immigrants come over no matter where they settle. They tend to stay together in these little enclaves. Even in the Southeast, we have a lot of Jewish people that come to the southeastern United States, and they form in their communities. And we've got in the Southeast, we've got the French, they were forced out of Canada during the American Revolution that have settled in Louisiana. We have the Spanish Florida, and that's a concentration of Spanish-speaking people. We have with Texas Mexican Americans that are strongly influenced by the combination of Spanish and Native American. They're isolated communities because of they're isolated because of their language. They haven't learned English yet. They haven't adopted the customs of their English, mainly English-dominated culture neighbors. They don't speak the language. So they have these isolated communities. But during the Civil War comes around, and it starts throwing massive groups of people that from these isolated communities and these isolated food cultures, they start getting thrown together. And some good comes out of it, some bad comes out of it. The bad comes out of it is you have a lot of disease. 2 out of every 3 soldiers died during the Civil War died of disease. So you have a lot of communicable diseases with men packed on each other that are not used to being around each other. So that's going to kill a lot of guys. But their cultures are going to blend together. They're going to start to form a more distinctive American food culture. There's some foods we think of today as very regional, and there's some foods that are very American. It's spread across, and the Civil War helped spread those unique ideas of those food culture across through close contact with guys in camp. People, are using their rations to fix recipes, and somebody's like, well, what is that thing? I've never seen that before. That smells good. Or they're asking for boxes from home, and family members are sending them food items, and they're asking questions. They're trying new things, and they're learning and passing on these different food traditions among each other. To give you a sampling of what kind of mixing of cultures that somebody might find, I'm going to read you a snippet from a diary from Robert Watson. Watson was a soldier in Florida in the 7th Florida Infantry. He has a connection because he later joined the Confederate Navy, and the CSS News Civil War Interpretive Center is mainly talks about the CSS News, a ironclad Confederate naval ship, so he has a connection. He writes, February 23rd, 1862 is Sunday. Truly, this is a cosmopolitan company. It is composed of Yankees, crackers, which is what people from Florida were called back then, crackers. Conches, those are the people mainly from the islands of Bahamas, but it could be from any of the Caribbean islands. Englishmen, Spaniards, Germans, Frenchmen, Italians, Poles, Irishmen, Swedes, Chinese, Portuguese, Brazilians, and Watson himself said, I am a rock scorpion Crusoe, which is a term for somebody that just jumped around from island to island, kind of like a hobo of the sea, from going back and forth from Florida to the Keys to Jamaica to Cuba to all of the different islands. All are good Southern men. They are also Scotchmen, Welshmen, and some half Indians. Surely this is the greatest mixture of nations for a small company that I ever heard of. So that's a lot of different cultures combined into 100 men from Florida. So that's a little sampling. Now, of course, men did form into units that composed all of the different nationality. You have the Irish Brigade in the Union Army. You have all German units. You have all Polish, all Spanish, all Italian. They're famous units of all people from one community. But typically, the Union Army and Confederate Army guys are mixed together. Units from Texas have, like I said, those Mexican Americans. They have white folks that went and settled in Texas. They have Native Americans because the Trail of Tears. We took the 5 civilized tribes from eastern United States and took them to Oklahoma. So a lot of them serve out west. Here in North Carolina, we have Cherokee that form a unique unit, Thomas Legion, and fight in the Confederacy. But also in the north, you have northeastern Native Americans and Native Americans from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois that join the Union Army and fight. So you've got concentrated cultural units, but typically they're spread out. They're spread out through like the sampling we just read through. So let's look at some of these unique cultures in there that maybe I hadn't mentioned before. And pointing out, typically when someone looks at this list, the nationality in his list that jumps out the most to them is Chinese. What we need to remember is that people from all over Asia are represented both in the Confederate and Union Army. Why that is the whaling trade and shipping. The whaling ships would go into the Pacific and they would pick up new crew members when the ports they stopped in, and the whaling ships went to Japan, to Korea, China, down into Indonesia, over kind of the Indian Ocean. So you've got people from all the Pacific islands. You have Maori from New Zealand, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans. They come back to these whaling ports, and you have Chinese and Asian Americans in Union units, and also they come to New Orleans and Charleston, and so we have Asian Americans in these units. Of course, they're bringing with them cooking styles that they're used to, and flavors from home, and spice combinations and things they're used to, and that's going to affect the food. This particular company has a good blend from all over the world in it. And so he's going to have a unique, all those different guys are going to have foods they like, and it's going to kind of blend together and do stuff. And they're going to experience foods that they're not used to. The Florida crackers, the guys native to Florida, their culture's already a mix of Spanish and English and Native American cultures. So they already have a unique cuisine, and their cuisine is going to be somewhat similar to Spanish cuisine, but not really, because the Spanish cuisine is going to lack the Native American component. It's going to be different than the Brazilian cuisine, because Brazilians have different Native Americans, different ingredients that are from there, and different enslaved people that came there. The Portuguese and the Brazilian might share a dish they both like, because the Portuguese settled in Brazil, so they might share some things. So there's dishes, they're going to be common, but different stuff. And there's going to be blends. You're going to want to make this thing, but you ain't got all the ingredients. So you're going to mix it together, have unique kind of food fusion stuff going on. Some of the few dishes that are kind of regionalized, that kind of spread all over the United States. One of them in the Northeast is Boston baked beans. Boston baked beans was kind of restricted to New England, before the Civil War, and they get issued out army beans. You have access to molasses and honey and maple syrup, maybe from home. So the style of doing Boston baked beans, lends itself particularly good to soldiers that are in camp, like in winter quarters. So Germans and Irish soldiers and soldiers that have never had Boston baked beans, guys in their units that were familiar with making it, they would make it. It's easy to pick up, and that food tradition spread baked beans. Baked beans are consumed all over the United States today, and it was just a regional New England uh, food item. There's some other things that we don't really think about that were actually very regional dishes before the Civil War. Clam chowder was, and some of the other chowders were very kind of regionalized to New England. It's chowder thing is an easy thing to make. It's spread kind of across the Northeast. It didn't pick up so much in the South, but across the Northeast, most Union soldiers, learned how to make Boston baked beans. They found out about clam chowder. There's a couple other dishes that were really popular in New England. They ended up spreading to the rest of the North and eventually into the South over time. In the South, those distinctive food kind of cultures in the southeastern United States that we think about when we think Southern food, you've got basically Tidewater, Virginia, Low Country, South Carolina, and the Cajun and Creole of the New Orleans area, and then like kind of the mixture fusion between Texas and Mexican food, and then the mountain like all Appalachian food. These food become mixed in. Someone that was from North Carolina would have never had experience jambalaya, gumbo, some of these things from the Creole and Cajun cuisine, but those men serving together in the Army in Northern Virginia and in units and in camp and experience, they picked those up, and some they had good spices. The spices were pretty easily accessed, so you have some of that spread. You have a love of rice from South Carolina. The Low Country grew a lot of rice. In North Carolina, between Virginia and South Carolina, so we have influence from the rice culture. We have influence from the Tidewater, Virginia, very much pork-based English that affects our kind of diet. So you have people exposed to Hoppin' Johns from South Carolina, a rice dish that was spread out all over the South. There's, basically the idea of fried chicken was kind of regionalized in a couple of places and became very popular after the Civil War. A lot of the cooking done in the Confederate Army was done by manservants and African American enslaved people. So some of that culture of cooking was spread among the white soldiers, particularly the lower class privates and private soldiers like that. They were typically lower class white farmers. They were used to eating those ingredients too, so they picked up different cultural cooking techniques and spread that all over the South. And there were some food items. Canning had become industrialized during this time period. So some canned foods, some food that men had never experienced before, may have been consumed as a delicacy during the Civil War, and with the cheapness of them, like canned fish, like canned salmon, canned oysters, some canned fruit that was hard to get, came in, even in the South, the supply to soldiers late in the war. So that added into cultural fusions of food. So throwing all these guys from different cultures together created a uniquely American cuisine. Among those, it took all those southern cultures in the South, food traditions, and mixed them all together, and the same thing in the North, mix those together, and then there's crossbleed between the two, between Northern and Southern units that kind of bleed together as far as people sharing culture, traditions, and seeing things other people were doing, and seeing people cook things as prisoners of war, early on. So the war just blends all these people together. One of the other unique things, other than food, I'll mention is that people don't think about is music changed. The music we have today, rock and roll, is classic American. It comes with a mixture of jazz and blues and different origins. But think about traditional, what we call traditional bluegrass music, those instruments of the guitar, the fiddle, the bass, the mandolin, and the banjo. The banjo has origins in Africa. The mandolin is from southeastern Europe, particularly Italy. The guitar is from Spain. The fiddle is mainly played, comes from the fiddle style comes from Scotland, Ireland. So you have the Scot-Irish fiddle, the African banjo, the Spanish guitar, the mandolin from southeastern Europe, and those were all present in the Confederate Army. All those influences, so those instruments come together. So it's unique kind of birthplace, not just of food, but of music. Thank you for joining me. I know you're going to have questions, but the main reason we want to do this is to spur you to think about what are some traditional foods in your family and start thinking about where those ingredients come from. Where in the world do the vegetables, the spices and stuff come from, and what does that tell you about your family's origin or history? What cuisine or culture does it come from? Where is that? What is some of your favorite food from, and what does it take to build those together? So, thank you for joining us. I know you're going to have questions. You're going to be able to ask them, type them in here in a minute in the chat bar, and I'm going to get to those. And thank you for joining me.